programming language, and Pascal. And that was that long ago. And that actually created this curiosity in IT. So when I moved to Australia, I actually pursued a career in IT. So I became a IT professional, and I've worked as a ICT regional manager, network manager, programmer, and so on and so forth. So worked quite a bit in the industry, and I was quite keen on teaching. Teaching was a passion of mine. Even when I was in school, the teachers would actually ask me to take some classes for junior students, and I was quite popular as a teacher. But that wasn't a profession in Sri Lanka. That was, that wasn't a highly qualified, highly paid profession. So because I was good at maths, I went to do civil engineering, but teaching was at the back of my head all the time. So when I came to Australia, I actually accidentally applied to TAFE and started, after having industry experience as an IT professional, started as an IT teacher. So I was actually, and from there I went into teacher, head teacher, managed education, went back into building and construction, and looked after plumbing, carpentry, and all the electrotechnology and all that as well. Faculty director, and finally I'm in TAFE New South Wales. So I've been there in TAFE New South Wales for 25 years, doing every job that you can imagine there. And appointed as the head of Skills Point for Technology and Business Services for TAFE New South Wales. So I actually implemented the first training package qualifications in ICT called ICA 99 when I was an IT head teacher. So that's my background, and now I joined Digital Skills Organization as Chief Innovation Officer, working with KID and the more here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gitani. And Ian, I'm sure there's many listening today who have met you or at least know of you, but please, share a brief history of your time in VET. We'll just need to unmute yourself there, Ian.
Sorry about that.
Yep.
I started life as an apprentice fabricator in the railways in South Australia, 1978 or something. By the time I'd gotten to 1985, I was a union activist and spent some time in and out of the union office helping out. I came to the union office in 1989. I ended up staying there until the end of last year when I retired. So I ended up as the National Coordinator for Skills Training and Apprenticeships. So I was sort of handling the union's engagement on a national basis with the training system in all its glory. That meant I was sitting on industry skills councils, I was sitting on offshore skills recognition working groups, NQC working parties, state regulators for apprenticeships, state VET board and things like that. So I've done a lot of things for my sins, but my passion has always been defending the value of work and trying to find ways to better express that, hence my support for the notion of competency standards as a bedrock of the training system. I don't support the notion that we have a competency-based training system. We can get to that if you want, but I've spent the last 20 or so years battling away, trying to defend the notion that competence is what matters in the world of work, and we need to spend more time analysing what we need rather than how we're going to deliver it, because you can't deliver it until you know what you need. So the weaknesses in the system to me are a delivery rather than product oriented, and that's got more to do with the way we regulate than it does to do with the way we try to train people. So I think there's some bones in the system, and I spent all that time trying to work through a conversation about how you identify those and deal with them systematically, and put all of the sort of emotive debates to one side while we get at the question of what is the purpose of the VET system, because I think that's central to everything.
Well, thanks, Ian. I'm looking forward to your contributions as we progress today. And Hugh, there might be a few people, maybe the odd one or two, who haven't yet come across you or your work in your vast career in the vet sector. But please share just a little bit about yourself and your time in the vet space.
Well, going back in my early history, I was an escaped botanist and went to work at RMIT in 1981, where the head of aircraft, civil and fluid power said to me, well, Hugh, you've joined TAFE, now you're moving from the veggies to the animals. So that was my thrilling introduction to it all. So working at RMIT from 1981, joined NCVER in 1987, wrote a book with Roger Harris on CBT, Between a Rock and a Whirlpool, which some of you may have been victims of. Another paper in 2009, and it was interesting that that paper was commissioned by the late and great Peter Noonan, where he was saying, look, it's time for us to have a discussion of how far we might shift our conception of what CBT is. So it was an attempt to do that, which by the time, I guess, we'd gone through all the bits and pieces, it really didn't shift that far, and the definition hasn't really shifted much from the initial conception in 1991 to the present day, although there has been some movement. So my particular background is in curriculum development, teaching, learning and assessment, and in reality about provider capability and teacher capability. So I think I probably sit on the other side from Ian in the sense that he would view things from the work perspective, but still very mindful and respectful of what vet tries to do. I'm the opposite. I'm very respectful of what enterprises and industry is trying to do, but also see sometimes the challenges that vet providers have in turning the concepts of training packages into the reality of delivery on the ground. And I agree with Ian, a lot of the problem is around regulation.
I don't think we're that different at all, Hugh. I think a decent conversation today might just show how aligned we are in terms of that.
We probably are, Ian.
So I won't need to say I'll be the referee and you'll have in the red corner and we'll have the blue corner. So
can I be the red corner being the union official?
Yeah, that's right. We'll have a clean fight, okay? Okay, so thank you. No, but thank you for sharing sort of a little bit of background about yourselves, because I think it is helpful for those tuning in today just to get a sense of, I guess, the context of why we've approached you three to participate in this discussion. Okay, so we'll kick on. Now, competency-based training is an approach to vet designed to develop the skills and knowledge and individual needs to meet the standards determined by industry for contemporary workplaces. And this approach to training is focused on the individual and their ability to apply skills and knowledge in ways that meet the requirements of work. Now, for the last 3 decades or so, CBT has been fundamental to how accredited vet is delivered in Australia. And over this time, there's been both advocates and critics of this approach. Among the benefits highlighted by CBT advocates is having a training system aimed at servicing the needs of industry and the workplace. It's a system that is open to all occupations and sectors. And that the national industry standards used in CBT have also been fundamental to establishing some national consistency, although I think that's to varying success. Criticisms of the approach include concerns around the degree of prescription and bureaucracy associated with it, impeding the vet sector's ability to respond quickly to change, or indeed be forward-looking, possibly maybe being accused of being more focused on what was or what is rather than preparing people for what could be. Now, the Australian Government Department of Employment and Workplace Relations has focused on this prescriptiveness of the training system and what they see as its impact on transferability of skills and job mobility as a key challenge for the training system, and has proposed a new qualifications model to counter this. Now, we may get time, it may probably be interwoven through our conversation today, but we may get time to delve into that proposed model a little more. I missed out on the information session, and I'm just trying to work through the materials that are available online. So I would have to say I'm not coming from an expert view on that model at all. But the focus of this discussion today is not necessarily on the strengths or weaknesses of the CBT model per se. We're going to sort of skirt around that a little bit by focusing on a few particular aspects and have a discussion about whether there is a cause for, or whether we can add value to this key training approach in the vet sector. So a strength of the CBT approach is that the technical skills that a learner needs to achieve to be deemed competent in a workplace are clearly defined. And so let's just have a focus on that concept of competency. And Hugh was, I guess Hugh and Ian were both, touching on that. So in our standards for RTOs, competency is defined as the consistent application of knowledge and skill to the standard of performance required in the workplace. It embodies the ability to transfer and apply skills and knowledge to new situations and environments. It's a pretty succinct definition, and it emphasises the primacy of the workplace, I think, in framing the concept of competency. And the associated clauses show a very task-focused conception of competency, which is somewhat different to how definitions of competency are used in some international countries. For example, in European Union countries, the concept of competence covers cognitive elements, so use of theory, concepts, tacit knowledge, the functional aspects, or those technical skills, as well as interpersonal attributes such as social organisational skills, along with ethical values. In Germany, I'm just going to share this slide because it's very wordy. In Germany, the German qualifications framework for lifelong learning describes competence as the ability and readiness of the individual to use knowledge, skills, and personal, social, and methodological competences and conduct himself or herself in a considered and individually and socially responsible manner. But it's broken down into basically two main types of competencies. It's professional competence, which refers to that breadth and depth of knowledge and that instrumental and systemic skills and judgment, or the technical skills required, as well as this personal competence. So we're looking here at social competence, so team leadership skills, communication, collaboration, etc. And this notion of autonomy or self-competence, such as taking responsibility of one's actions, learning, self-reflection. And I guess some may consider this type of categorization of competence, or this definition, is moving towards describing an individual's capability. In this particular framework, the German qualifications framework for lifelong learning, the professional and the personal competence is brought together in this concept of competence to act. And it's considered that these competences here, the professional and personal, are interconnected. You can't have one without the other. And I also, in doing that CBT paper, looked at a few other countries, but I found that Singapore's workforce skills qualification system had a very clear focus on both technical skills and the competencies, plus sort of our more generic, like our employability, non-technical skills and competencies. And these sort of non-technical generic ones were referred to as critical core skills. There's 16 critical core skills in this Singapore's workplace skills qualification system. And they're covering skills such as creative thinking, problem solving, collaboration, customer orientation, learning agility, adaptability, and digital fluency. And I found it interesting that the critical core skills in this Singapore qualification system are distinct, standalone and accessible skills, which means there's a low risk of these skills getting hidden or lost within technical skills or assumed to be acquired simply through, you know, the training or education and assessment processes. In Australia, we've tended more to embed these types of core skills within our training packages. So like with the employability skills, which there were attempts, was that like 2005 or 6 or so, I think. There was the employability skills work and embedding those in training packages. And also, of course, our English language literacy and numeracy skills were to be embedded within training packages, all with varying success. Because a key element there also comes down to the vet teacher or trainer's ability to be able to identify and teach and assess those skills. Okay, so a big start, and so with that as context, I'm going to put the first question to Ian and Hugh. Is there cause to consider how competence is defined in the standards for RTOs? Does that definition need to be broadened to explicitly cover personal or non-technical competencies, which, you know, occurs, we've seen some other definitions of competence in international countries, particularly given that jobs and work in the future are, you know, going to be more service-based, more knowledge-based. So Ian, I'm going to throw to you first. What's your view on the current definition of competency as described in the standards? Do you think it sufficiently covers all the aspects of what an individual may do in undertaking their job role?
Well, I don't think there's been any doubt. I was, in prepping for this, went back to a speech that our national president did in 2008, and the debate was being had then about these sorts of matters. I would reject out of hand the notion that sort of competency standards reflect technical skills and have some sort of fence around them that prevents the application of all of the enabling capabilities that are required to perform work in a modern workplace today. Workplaces are far more complex now than they were in 2008. They will be far more complex again very shortly. They are evolving all of the time. And yet we are hidebound as a country in an archaic definition of what we think the definition of competency means. Competency in all its glory encompasses all of the things that you're talking about, this notion of, you know, professional competence being separate from personal competence. Their badges, their labels like employability skills, capabilities. We need to get down to talking about what it takes to operate in a modern world, and we shouldn't be putting these labels on. I think the failure is not one of competency standards, and I'd worked on the project that modelled the very first set of competency standards in the manufacturing industry in the early 90s, and I've been involved in the writing of training packages, what an absurd term, in the writing of training packages ever since, right up until the end of the industry reference committees and the ill-fated MEM release 2 that created, you know, so much drama. So we have always envisaged a need to embody these sorts of capabilities into the delivery of training that leads to competence. I think the weakness that we have compared to Germany and others, and I mean, I've been to Germany about 3 or 4 times, I think the staggering difference, the glaring difference is that they have a national framework curriculum that is designed to meet the standards that they write. And that's where they can do the work. And this is why I think I agree with Hugh more than he thinks I do. We've been calling for a national framework curriculum because that's where you can do this stuff. You cannot do it by writing additional words into a training package that ASWER can then batter training providers with. We have a regulatory environment that's about punishing the training system because there is poor behaviour in the training system. And the way to do that is constantly ramp up the requirements for training packages, what font size you can use. Antigave, the metal engineering MERS ITAB, $80,000 to change the format from landscape to portrait because they all had to be the same. It's bizarre, the rules that we invent to try and solve problems that are not about producing the workforce of the future. So we think that let industry set the standard for performance in the workplace, then let industry and the training system negotiate a framework curriculum that can cater for all of the other bits that are not well placed inside competency standards. We didn't set out as a manufacturing industry to write qualifications. We set out to write competency standards associated with the performance of work in all of the contexts that apply to that. It was simpler back then, it's more complicated now, just means you've got to work harder to get it right.
And Hugh, so when you say about all the other bits that fall outside the competency standards, so what do you mean by that? Can you unpack that for me?
Well, some of the notions around cognitive skills, how do you set a standard for that? Now, I had a lark with Steve Balzar at an ACTU conference when he was explaining his grand plan for employability skills, because one of them was sense of humour. Another one was integrity. And I was asking him what his definition of that was. How does he set a standard for all of the employers that were members of ACCI? Or the AIG does it for all of their members, or a union does it for all of their employees, or whatever. Who's going to set that standard, and what sort of war is that going to create? Trying to determine a standard for honesty, integrity, sense of humour, because they were part of the employability skills debate. Now, that died, as it should have, because it doesn't have a foundation in something that you can measure. The world of work provides a bit of a foundation for that. The VET system is not designed to make up for all of the ills of our general education system, but it can make up for many of them. A lot of second chance stuff going on, a lot of bolt-on education for people who didn't get it the first time round. You know, we can do wonders with the VET system that we have, but the absence of a curriculum is killing portability, it's killing transferability, and it's killing the opportunity to build the sort of cognitive skills and other capabilities that we need to challenge the future, to win the future. We talk about the skills we need for the future we want. We've laid out our position about, I keep saying our, I'm not speaking for the OMWU, but those two papers set out a plan for how you might separate the responsibility for setting the standard for performance in the workplace and then building a worker who is a person as well. Laurie Carmichael talked about knowledge workers, I don't know, 30 years ago, that the future would be about knowledge work. It's not just about knowledge. We can't separate technical competence from any other kind of competence. They're all rolled into the individual. We want to build people who can engage in work, in society, in politics, in volunteering, in all of the things that we want. And the absence of a framework curriculum, industry by industry, is killing that notion.
Hugh, I'm going to turn to you, and yes, maybe you're more aligned in some of your views than what I might have thought. And I'm just going to, but I just will point out, so we've had a comment here about, you know, it sort of gets to your point about the competence issue. Ian, we've had a comment about is the concept of competence itself somewhat problematic, as judgments of competence are based on demonstration of knowledge skills at points in time. And so that could be your level of competence may vary depending on where you are at any point in time and what your knowledge and skills are in that particular area at any point in time. Do you want to take that up?
We did have a wording which said to the standard expected in the workplace. Now, in the Botanic Gardens, as Ian will know, there's probably Adelaide's fanciest restaurant. You have to sell a lung to go there. I can go down to the pub. The set of competency standards are the same. The standard the expectations of standards are different between, say, my local pub and that particular restaurant. So all of the competencies will be there. So it's just where you are, how you judge it. So the important word to add into what you said, Michelle, is context is important as well, and that may have an issue for portability. But anyway, to get round
Can I
those.
just think that to the standard required in the workplace means every single workplace. We're setting a standard, and that standard is the desired industry level standard. If Nick Papazahariakis, when he ran Chloe's in Adelaide,
It's not a standard, Ian. It's the expectations are different, dependent on the workplace. A lot of the things you would look at are absolutely the same, but the expectation of, say, if you went back to your boiler making, of some companies versus, you know, other organisations, depending on the nature of the work that they do and the standard that their clients expect. So it's a way of describing things, but there is no uniform standard, or if there is, it has to be a minimal one.
No, I don't think that a minimal standard. What we're talking about is an industry level desired standard for effective performance in the generic workplace. If someone wants to go well above and beyond, like, you know, I mentioned Nick Papazahariakis from Chloe's in Adelaide, great restaurant. He will always go above and beyond. He's closed the restaurant now, but he was always looking to train people to a higher standard. The question is that the role of the public purse in publicly funded VET? And I say that it is better to create a standard and have the public fund the standard. And if somebody wants to bank on having a higher standard than that, then they invest in that as a business. So, you know, I don't think we gain much from sort of having that debate. I'd love to talk to you about that on this particular forum. But we think that the notion of a standard is set by industry, and the capacity building that goes on beyond, you know, what Michelle described as the technical standard or technical skill, that goes on in a curriculum. And if employers want a better trained workforce, they can pay for that. You know, I was a taxpayer until I retired.
So the issue for the provider is to decide a standard which will get people close enough to the top level and possibly overtrain those at the lower level. So that's where there's a disjuncture between that. But let's not go into that and continue. I guess the point that struck me was it is probably around those 21st century skills and what have you, which I agree vehemently with Ian, are there in the standards. And there's two ways in which you can address that. Either you can take them out and put them as separate standards, where essentially you're doing what the Singapore people do and what have you, or you can design your teaching model such that you seek to make sure that people are developing and getting challenged in those sorts of skills. The trouble is, it gets back to, Michelle, you will remember Peter Thompson, our late Deputy Director at NCVER. He was an assessment expert. Basically, his thing with CBT, which is not assessed, is not valued. So it's the extent to which you actually have those types of you have that in your assessment framework. So maybe that's a failing by, you know, providers, that they're not doing this properly. But then we funded a project when I was still at NCVER, where we were where there was one provider. It was actually Torrens Valley TAFE when there was one, where they actually helped students reflect on whether they knew about problem solving, how they were communicating, what sort of, because these were the skills that they were being asked about when they went for job interviews. So the big thing is that most organisations will say we either value these foundational employability 21st century skills more than technical skills, or we equally value them with technical skills. Relatively few organisations are wholly and solely concerned with technical skills.
I agree absolutely about that.
And we've got to move on. I'm very conscious of time, and I'd like to hear from Gaetani in a minute. But I guess also too, the implications then. So say, for example, if you make them more explicit. So say if we looked at these employability, 21st century skills, or actually take them out, make them more explicit, what would that mean, or the implications for our vet teachers and trainers and assessors? Like, then we develop a whole niche group of teachers and trainers and assessors? Because at the moment, no. So yeah, so what are the implications then? They keep going?
Well, I think what we're doing is setting teachers up to fail. They cannot have the breadth of knowledge that is required. So you have to contextualise, I think, for the industry. And that's why I'm talking about an industry framework curriculum where you can contextualise those things for the industry sector and then absorb them into the delivery that is around the competence for the particular occupation. Otherwise, you're going to have what's being proposed now in some of the skills reform areas, where you might have 20 applications of the same variation of a particular skill, and we're not geared. We can't produce the teachers that we need now. You know, and the teacher education programs that we have are poorly funded. Where they're funded, Karen O'Reilly-Briggs in Victoria, they shut down her teacher education program that was trying to encourage, you know, former tradies and experienced workers to come and pick up the teacher skills that they need to engage as vet trainers. Got defunded. So, you know, we can't deal with it in that way. And rather than produce more portable and transferable skills, we're producing more micro skills that have much more specific application than existing competence. And so an explicit application, that's not the way to go, in my humble opinion.
No, I'm not talking about explicit, I don't think. I'm really, I would agree with Ian in the sense that it has to be contextualised in the sense of the way communication skills or, you know, a whole mess of other things are practiced in that particular occupational area. Now, if people who are supposed to have industry knowledge and teaching those things don't understand that, then they shouldn't be teaching them. Our biggest difficulty was, and this was my early days at RMIT, where we tried to compartmentalise those, like we would have English language people teaching written skills. Well, that really didn't work. You had to contextualise it, and we tried to run generic classes around that. So you would have escaped high school teachers who would be saying, oh, well, I'm teaching writing class, I've got to give them a bit of Shakespeare. And I remember talking to one of these teachers, and I said, so what are you teaching this course to? And she said, oh, I'm in the teaching the diploma of dry cleaning. And I said, so the bit about out, damn spot would be pretty important then. She didn't take that well.
Toil, whatever, Macbeth around the cauldron. Okay, right, let's move on. Okay, otherwise we're not going to get through this. Okay, so let's now talk about whether the current CBT approach is suitable for all types of qualifications, or indeed all jobs. Now I'm going to turn to Gaetani here. The model to digital skill development, which the Digital Skills Organisation has put forward, is a skills-based model, which moves away from or extends the CBT approach. Can you explain what this skills-based model is and why it's considered a more suitable approach for digital skills development? And would you like me to bring up the first slide for you? Oops. Oh, you've got to just unmute yourself. Hold on. No. Oh no. If you go up to, you should be able to hit the little microphone up the top there on the left on the panel. Oh, there you go. Oh. Oh no. Okay, just bear with us. Oh, I think just bear with us while Gaetani might come back on. Look, in the meantime, what's that, Hugh?
I said, where's a lip reader when you need one?
No, I know.
Just pick
Okay,
up
so
on something, Bill. This notion of, are all jobs and occupations suitable for CBT qualifications? The whole discussion about the role of qualifications in this is problematic. If we are trying to produce workers, not all of them will require or neatly fit the design model that we have for qualifications, which I think is quite bizarre. I've sat on IRCs and ISCs and all the other ICs and whatever alphabet soup that we've had for 30 years about competencies.
Oh,
yes. Back again.
I'm here. Oh, excellent. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. There you go.
Look, just bear with me. I'm going to put your slide on, and Ian, we also started talking about Ian's view on the applicability or appropriateness of CBT for all qualifications. We'll come back to that. Also, there is a whole lot of comments and questions that we hopefully we'll be able to get to, because Ian, that some were referring to some of the points that you were making about a framework curriculum. So we'll get back to those. But Gitani, I'm just going to move on to your slide now. And yeah, could you just give us, I'd like to learn more about what this skills-based approach is that DSO is using or putting forward.
So I intend to break this myth that skills-based approach is actually standing in tension with competency-based training. It's actually, I would like to argue that what we are proposing is something that complements competency-based training, and it does not outline how the training needs to be done or how the training needs are going to be articulated in training programs. What we have done is, things that Hugh and Ian just discussed, all those things we were grappling with all that. And what we wanted to do was, given that the digital skills sector has a huge skills shortage, TCA is saying we need 1.2 million workers by 2025, and so many RMIT reports that talk about that sort of acceleration, and showing that the supply of digital skills is not going to meet, the current supply is not going to meet the demands of the numbers. The skill shortages are going to widen more and more as the technology is evolving. It's going to have a rapid effect of the numbers as well. So the approach that we have built is to actually build it for transferability. So what we are trying to say is to build a common skills taxonomy. I think Ian, who talks about we need to understand what the industry wants. So this is about, now the digital industry is vast. It's got high vertical skills and horizontal skills, digital skills that sits across so many different industries like manufacturing. Okay, so given that the nature of the digital skills, what we said was, by articulating the requirements at the workplace in terms of skills rather than tasks, because you could have a skill and you could apply that skill in so many different task contexts. So by focusing on skills to articulate what's required at workplace, we can ensure better transferability of those skills from one task to another, from one job to another, as well as, whereby doing that, people will be able to recognize the skills that they have, that they gain through another job into a different job environment. So we're talking about job mobility, and also you find, in order to get to say 1.2 million, so TCA, Tech Council Australia, talks about getting to 1.2 million. Now, in order to do that, particularly in the ICT sector, where there's this idea that you need to have a master's level or a bachelor's level qualification in ICT to get an IT job, takes 3 years, 4 years to finish, when we need to produce workers in much more volume and velocity coming through. It's about taking advantage of the vet sector and actually producing skilled people faster. So I might go to the next slide to just explain and unpack it a bit more, and I'm sure there will be questions there. So what we are doing is, we have created a common skills taxonomy, What that means is it just by clustering, by actually articulating the skill requirements at the workplace rather than going into the task level, like in a competency. When you look at competency, dimensions of competency, it talks about the task and task management skills and contingency management skills and things like them. So what we've done is, what are the skills that are required, staying above one level to say what are the skills that are required, and we have actually put them into a common taxonomy, common language that we could use, such as what are the skills requirements for a job in the industry, like penetration tester or a cyber analyst or whatever. So we've actually gathered all the skills and said, here are the skills that we want. And then we actually put them, group them into skills clusters, whereby we could go to employers, and employers, we could actually develop training programs that are using this modular flexible approach, notwithstanding qualifications, but within qualifications, within micro-credentials, whatever that is required for that job, we've actually enabled that employer co-design of training solutions coming to it. So it's about designing for delivery rather than it's saying this is how you deliver CBT is out. So it's about, and we've actually built this based on existing skills framework like SOFIA, like Australian core skills framework that talks about, the critical skills, the core skills that are required, as well as the critical core skills. If you look at, again, when you look at the Australian skills classification, that talks about specialist tasks and core competencies within job roles. And we've actually said we're going to talk about skills and core skills. Anything, it has technical, human, leadership, whatever the skills that are required, we express them as clusters of skills, groups of skills that you may need to use in order to perform a job. So what we're saying is that it actually adds value to the competency-based training, where you could actually utilize, have a better view of what the industry wants, what sort of skills, rather than looking at that task level to say, here are the skills, and then when they deliver, they have to deliver to that particular job. And you could use competency-based training, something that's tested, something that's worldwide accepted, something that has produced result, and something that teachers are quite familiar with. So it doesn't mean that get rid of CBT and then bring in a skills-based approach. It means that articulate the skills required and then look at the application of that skill within the workplace. And that, when you actually use that modular flexible approach, you could actually use this concept of stackable micro-credentials. Again, I said it doesn't eliminate qualifications, but what it does is it allows you to prepare workers for those job roles, because we have given a framework to articulate the skills required for that job roles. So people will be more aware to stack the skills, stack the micro-credentials as they need it, and then move on to that VET qualification, move on to the university qualification, or whatever that their career will take them into. So that's the essence of the skills-based approach. It's a taxonomy. It brings learners, training providers, mainly training providers and industry into a common language to articulate what they want. And that way we will be able to, as the, given that we are in the technology era, as the technology changes, they articulate that skill within this taxonomy, and the training providers has got that freedom. I mean, I think Ian, again, or he talked about that, you can't add more and more into training packages. So ASQA can, hammer and say, this is how you do it, this is the task and all that. What we're trying to do is, by actually bringing that up, to give the training providers freedom to use the teachers to use their occupational expertise. And as Hugh said, occupational expertise means that if you're going to be doing penetration testing in a work environment, you're not just an IT geek or IT person who just do technical skills. You need to be talking to people. You need to be writing reports. You need to be doing everything in the context of a penetration tester. So that sort of occupational expertise that includes technical leadership and human skills into the training environment. It just gives them that freedom to do that, because what we're looking at is a step higher than a task and saying, let's look at skills and let's cluster them, group them into functions that can be contextualized and put into these work situations, training situations to train people for job roles. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure there might be questions around that, but let me throw it back at you, Michelle.
No, well, look, thanks, Kitani. So you're talking about, so my question, there's quite a few here actually coming through, and then I've got to bring in Hugh and Ian. So these skills clusters, can you apply them more broadly outside of, say, the digital skills space? So, so is it skills clusters as opposed to occupational clusters of skills? Do you know what I mean?
It's skills clusters because we've actually looked at a skills cluster like data analytics. Data analytics can sit in a job role that's done by a, say, a factory floor worker who's actually got lots of Internet of things, devices, things, creating data and all that sort of thing. So you could see that that particular skills cluster is not restricted to a job as a data analyst or data scientist. That skill actually is used by quite a lot of other positions, executive leaders and so on and so forth, where they actually have to perform data analysis. Now, Hugh talked about the performance expected at work. So we're saying that with a, say, data analysis skill, a data analyst might need to use that skill at a much higher level than an executive leader. But it's, it's the performance that's expected for their particular job might vary, but the skill is the same. They need to be able to do data analysis. So, we can unpack it when you talk about proficiency levels, but that's essentially, so our skills clusters, problem solving as a skills cluster will sit in a job of a penetration tester. That job role will have certain skills clusters sitting alongside, and that includes the critical core skills as well as technical skills, leadership skills and management skills, whatever that's required for that job role, and to the level, performance level, I'm not going to use the word standard, performance level expected for that particular job role.
There's a question. So with this notion of stackable micro-credentials, this sort of concept, I think, is similar to something that happens in Finland, Netherlands, in terms of the way that they've got different modules of technical and more sort of core skills plus specializations, and they can stack them up and use them in different ways, get different combinations of sort of modules or micro-credentials and put them in different formats to work to lead to different qualifications. There's a question about funding. I don't know if you've gone down that path yet of funding, these stackable micro-credentials. If funded for industry, will more or less training providers be able to provide the training? How do we regulate the training and assessing being provided? So with this sort of skills-based model, has the DSO been thinking about those sort of issues?
That's a very timely question. Absolutely. So we're actually writing the digital skills development model, a paper. The fourth section of that talks about funding and regulations, how there needs to be that flexible funding and regulation to support this sort of agile delivery of training to respond to industry requirements. There's pockets of funding happening at various places, like targeted priority funding that used to be in New South Wales and so on and so forth. However, that there needs to be a lot more holistic acknowledgement that this becomes the normal way of delivery, alongside full qualifications, because full qualifications definitely has a huge part in the society. And this is about acknowledging this sort of need for agile training models to respond to industry, and funding and the regulations supporting that. So stay tuned for the next paper.
Yeah, okay. I have so many questions popping up next to me. They're enjoying the conversation. Let me put it that way. Very, very quickly, because we've still got one more topic to touch. Ian, 25 words or less. Do you want to just continue or finish off that conversation you were having about what your views are in terms of the application of CBT, or does it apply to all qualifications or not?
I think characterising the mechanics of that based on qualifications is wrong. The skills required for work don't neatly fit the arcane qualifications model that has been visited upon us by the system. I mean, the first thing that's decided when you sit round a table looking to put a case for change to the states and territories, or at the centre of every decision that ever gets made, the first thing you have to decide is what kind of training product it is and at what AQF level, without having done any consultation whatsoever. You cannot get work done unless you answer those questions. I had the bizarre arrangement of having someone walk in the door and say, we need an AQF 1 level unit of competency for driving trains. I mean, just think that through. AQF 1 level unit for driving trains, because they wanted that to be the AQF level, because that had industrial implications. So, we should just design training products, competency standards, packages of competency standards, not with a qualification in mind. We should design them with the work in mind, not the job. There's a big difference between the job at a particular employer, and this is why I think the common skills taxonomy that Tana's talking about won't fly. You have to train everybody to the level that you think will apply everywhere, and nobody's going to pay for that. And certainly my fear is that, you might get funding for it, you might not, but who pays matters in this system. And it's one area where I'm with RTOs about saying, where is the money coming to do all of these grand things? And this one's a bit too grand for me, but we've got to start with the work. What does the work require? We've still got all sorts of things going on today. The technology of tomorrow's not here yet. It will be soon. We need to prep for that, but we've still got work to do today. So that means people are still out there oxy-cutting things, manually putting them together. Not everything's digital yet.
But the concept of a skills-based approach, though,
we've got a skills-based approach. We define those skills in competency terms.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's
stackable micro-credentials we used to call post-trade training. Individual units of competency can be stacked. The question around stackable micro-credentials is a funding question. Who's going to pay? Employers don't want to pay, so they look for funding.
I mean, I agree with what you're saying there, but what we have done is to just basically, try to eliminate that complexity, cumbersome task-based approach, and we've just gone one level up to be.
Githani, sorry, you've gone offline again. Githani?
Can't hear you again, Githani.
She can't hear you.
I mean, the notion that competency standards are task-based is quite false. I think there are some that have gone to too low a level of detail, but it's a simple tweak to fix that. So everything that can be done on what this skills-based approach talks about can be done with competency standards, but we are currently forced into designing competency units that fit a predetermined template for a qualification, a skill set, a micro-credential, or if in New South Wales, the NETM stuff, which is about catch and kill your own. I mean, we've got states doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and the notion of portable, transferable, and nationally recognised skills is pretty much dead. Pretty much dead because there is no standard.
Hugh, would you like to enter into the discussion?
Look, I think one of the interesting things here is that we have not yet implemented or even looked hard at how the Noonan report on the AQF is going to be turned into action. Now, the whole point is that our AQF is a fairly ancient beast. It was one of the first ones up there. What Peter tried to do, I think, was bring it in and into a more modern framework where we could embrace the sorts of things that Gitani is talking about, what Ian's been talking about, by micro-credentials, by stackable sorts of things. The New Zealanders are having a hard look at this. In doing the VDC newsletter, I am buried in stuff about micro-credentials and other sorts of things. Ian is right that there is an issue around who pays. On the other hand, we have 4.3 million people in the system. 1.25 million of them are in the government side of things. So there's obviously a pretty fair fee-for-service market. And that fee-for-service area is where a lot of private providers work, because they're not prepared to get tied down to everything that comes alongside government funding, which is all the regulatory sort of stuff. You know, the issues. I mean, I talk to a number of companies where they will say, I'm really, or companies and providers to say, I would love to be delivering to the local needs of my employers. They say, why have you got all this stuff in the program? I've got to, because it's in the training package, therefore I have to deliver it. They say, we don't want it. That's not the nature of our business. Sorry, got to do it. So you're sort of caught up in a bit of this this system. So it's going to, I think there's one word I'd like to see coming out with providers, and by and large, you can trust most providers to do the right things, particularly the government-funded ones or the government ones. So I think that's an important point. The second thing is localisation of meeting those local needs, and I think the interesting thing about where the new RTO standards are going to land in terms of self-assurance may be a way forward for us.
Now listen, I've just realised we're at the end of our hour. We're going to talk about proficiency-based assessment. Alice, I'm just going to ask my NCVER colleague, what's the process from here? Can we continue? If Alice is there.
Hi, Michelle. Sorry, yes, you can continue.
Okay, and Ian, Githini, and Hugh, are you okay to continue for a little bit longer?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so quickly, and it's sort of come up in some of the comments about proficiency, is that, oh gosh, I've just lost the comment. Isn't proficiency levels related to AQF? Let's just dive into that very quickly. We did touch on the subject in the piece that we published last year, and about the use of grading or proficiency-based assessment and whether it's appropriate in the context of CBT. You know, I mean, the use of it can motivate learners to perform to a higher standard. It might help them continue to develop their expertise while simultaneously imparting greater clarity to employers on how well employees can perform a task, but there are legitimate concerns about its potential to add even more complexity to a already extraordinarily complex training assessment system, including the need for well-constructed and agreed moderation frameworks to grade learners against. I see the Productivity Commission in its 5-year productivity inquiry released almost 2 weeks ago, I think, had it in one of its recommendations relating to improving vet teaching pathways and partnerships, that they recommended the Australian government should fund extra training and development programs for vet trainers and assessors so they can adequately perform independent and proficiency-based assessment. They called for that reconsideration of the adoption of grading practices also back in 2017, so it's obviously been an issue for them. But I mean, the vet sector, we've had a bit of a history though of graded assessment. I believe back, Hugh and Ian, you might want to, you'll probably know this better than I, but I believe back in the early 2000s there was some state-funded training, grading pilot models in Queensland and WA. I think it was only short-lived though, because there wasn't this sort of consistent application nationally, state and training territory level, or even provider level. And I think maybe the policy focus shifted to more to teach quality, like delivery and assessment practices. So But moving on, and I'm very mindful of the time, Katani, I know looking at the DSO model that digital skill standards incorporate levels of proficiency. So I'd like, can you just give us a brief explanation as to what proficiency levels are, how they were determined, what value does such form of assessment bring to the learner and to the current or future employer? I'll just bring up that slide for you.
Thank you. Let me again explain that what we have developed is not a training framework. It's not something about assessment. The status of proficiency is exactly like Hugh said, what's the expected level of performance at the workplace? And depending on the job role, for the same skill, we said same skill can be performed, we said, according to 5 levels, depending on the complexity, autonomy required, and so on and so forth. So what we actually said was that in order to articulate exactly what the job requires, we have to, with the skill, we have to say what level of performance would that job require. So the same skill, a penetration tester might use the same skill at probably say a depth level, but a cybersecurity engineer might need that skill at a proficient level. So what we did was there's a model called DRAFES and DRAFES skill acquisition model. So it's about the levels, the process that an individual go through as they acquire knowledge and skill, or acquire skill in order to perform a certain task. So they actually put that into 5 stages. A lot of frameworks use that, and it's to say a novice who just very quickly to say a novice will just follow the rules. Advanced beginner will follow the rule with a bit of understanding, and somebody in a level 3 adept is able to do a job in their familiar context using familiar tools. Someone who's in a proficient level needs to be working in familiar and unfamiliar context, probably transfer the knowledge to unknown tools as well, and the leader will actually set the standard tools and the methods that you're using and create new context, that sort of thing. So depending on your job role, you might have the same skill data analysis, but the level of application will be different. So it is different from the proficiency grading in a training sense, because this is about taxonomy. Thank you.
Okay. So it is different in the sense of, say for example, the Singapore workplace skills qualification system. They actually have, they apply a proficiency assessment model to actually determining the skill level of their critical core skills. So to say you have to be at this level, you're assessed, you have to meet that level of that particular core skill that's required for this particular job. Okay, so it's a bit different to that. Okay, Hugh and Ian, very quickly, I'm interested in your views.
I've lost Hugh.
Oh, we've lost Hugh. What's Ian? Ian,
I'm not seeing him.
No,
Can I
no.
answer that with an anecdote?
Yeah.
I was about a 3rd year apprentice. I was at TAFE, and I had to do a little test piece, a weld. So I had done this weld, and I thought it was pretty good. I took it in to get, quote, a mark for it. And I won't use the earthy Shakespearean language that the lecturer used on it, but he picked it up, turned it over, looked at it, turned it over again, handed it back to me and said, that's blah-de-blah. I'll give you 48% for it. I was around happy with that because I thought it was pretty good. And being the northern suburbs Adelaide young boy, I walked into the training room and tried to throw it through the window. I was very angry. Anyway, disappointingly, it hit the window, fell on the floor. Somebody else picked it up and thought that's all right and got 78% for it. Exactly the same weld. So I have in front of me, because I thought this might come about, this discussion, the old percentage marks versus a new proficiency type of thing, where 28% is grossly incompetent, 65% is mainly competent, 80% is mega competent, and 100% is unbelievably competent, unless you've got a standard for that. And unless the work allows people to demonstrate their proficiency, manufacturing is about standard operating procedures, always has been. And some of those standard operating procedures apply to people who've got very high levels of skill and quite routine levels of skill. But it's the design of the job that determines how much proficiency you're allowed to use. There's not a lot of creativity that is called for on factory floors. There's a lot in the design and other areas and problem solving, but the work will decide the proficiency that is required. And if we're going to pay for lead level proficiency when we're only applying novice level proficiency, employers will continue to walk away from the training system. Because the words I hear from nearly every employer that I've spoken to over 30 years, thousands of them, I only want blah, blah, blah. I only need, we don't want rocket scientists, we don't need rocket scientists. So the skill level that an individual has may not be the skill level that they get to apply in the workplace. So there's a lot of work to be done. Proficiency is not the answer because nobody's ever been able to define what it means. And we can't set a standard for it. So it will be teacher by teacher, provider by provider. And we can't regulate that.
It's interesting, someone in our work commented along those lines, you know, being deemed competent really should be saying it's like 100%, you know, because if it's not, if it's 80%, then what does that other 20% mean, right? Particularly if it comes to electrical, if you ain't competent in getting wires together, we're in a bit of trouble. You know, like if it's that 20% that you don't meet, you know, if you're deemed competent at 80%, what are we missing in the other 20%? So yeah, it's
we can't afford to have a conversation about 80%, 60%. That's why it's competent, not yet competent. What does the work require? Not the job, the work. What does the work require? And we've got to look at that work holistically. We have a transactional training system that delivers and assesses because we regulate transactionally each unit of competency. We need framework curriculum that deals with the delivery holistically, and we need assessment regimes that deal with clusters of skills. We get attacked, or we got attacked in the metals and engineering space because we had a lot of prerequisites attached to units. But we were trying to create clusters of skills that naturally go together. It should be assessed holistically in clusters. So, you know, if we start to talk about this outside the current framework that is visited upon us by bureaucrats, then we might be able to have a more sensible discussion like they did when we moved away from proficiency back in 1989-90, when there was a reason we moved away from it then. And that reason is every bit as valid today. We need to have a good hard talk with everybody in the system about the things that we can do to overcome the deficiencies in the system so that we can be a bit more proficient.
Well, I guess, and also too, thinking about our vet teachers and trainers and assessors, the difficulty there, and there's some comments here about if you do apply a proficiency approach, having that consistent, I mean, this is the difficulty, is having a consistent approach applied across, you know, for assessing how well somebody's doing something. It's got to be the same. You, Hugh, have to apply the same approach, or consistent with Ian, with Katina, with me, you know, and I think that's the difficulty. I think what would a proficiency-based assessment or grading approach to CBT, what would be the implications for our vet teachers and trainers and assessors? And quickly, Hugh, I don't know if you're in a position to answer that or talk to that really quickly, if you can.
Yeah, getting me to talk really quickly about anything, Michelle, is difficult. It is always a challenge to get to the idea of proficiency, because you've got to be so much more specific about what you're trying to do and what the levels are. I mean, Ian's talked to far more employers than I have, but very often when I was working in providers, we would get employers coming to us and saying, we would like an apprentice from your pre-apprenticeship program, who's the best one? So already you've made a proficiency decision, and that proficiency decision is probably being matched by your knowledge of that employer. So it can go on, but it's difficult. One thing we did talk about, and it's a bad word to use these days, but was the idea of profiling. which was essentially to look at the range of things that you were looking at and trying to get some sort of standard set of wording, which again would be difficult, and try and say, where do you sit on all these elements, which might give an employer a better idea. But again, that's all extra work for a very overworked, over-regulated vet workforce, which is having difficulty recruiting people, which is having difficulty retaining people. So I think I'd agree with Ian that this is, while it might be nice, it's not a place you want to go now until you make practitioners' work easier. Removing some of the stuff.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, obviously we've got the government doing the vet workforce capability blueprint, I think that's what it's called, so that's in train at the moment, so we'll have to wait and see what that you know, how that evolves. Look, we're going to call it a day. I apologise for those listening in. This has been a fabulous conversation. We have so much more we could talk about. We could go off about actually where does vet fit in this, the university's accord, and that's sort of that integrating with that tertiary education sector and all sorts of things, and the notion of competence and capability in that sort of context. But there's a tremendous amount of commentary and questions which I will go through later, and we'll may have to approach Ian, Kathini or Hugh later to answer, but we're going to have to call it a day. Just to finish up with, just bear with me, a bit of a plug here. Of course, we've got our annual conference, No Frills, happening in Melbourne, 19th to the 21st of July. Come along and join us if you can, and head over to the NCVER portal to find more details. And of course, always subscribe if you haven't already. For those who joined us today, you'll be getting a short online evaluation survey by email. We do appreciate if you take the time to provide some feedback. It does help us improve these experiences. We've had a few little technical glitches along today. A bit tricky when we're all split over the country, but look, I appreciate our speakers today. Thank you so much for joining this conversation about CBT, and I really appreciate those who've been online and joined in the conversation with us, and we will get back to your comments and questions. So thank you so much for today, and bye for now.
Bye.